Let's talk about all the ways in which assumptions show up in our conversations, our relationships, and our fights. Since I've been making assumptions and paying the price for them for years now, I'll share my stories as examples of what not to do and offer some alternative approaches. You should be warned, though, I talk about some tough topics, and some of that might be triggering for you. Because to me, I don't think it's acceptable to not talk about this stuff. Oh, I'm also a little cussy. Please take care of yourself as you listen. Make yourself comfortable, grab a snack and a drink, and let's get started. Welcome back to Confessions of a Chronic Assumer. I'm Ellen Patnode, your host, a chronic assumer myself. Today, we're going to be talking about how assumptions show up in all kinds of human gatherings, from meetings to one-on-one conversations that we have to, telling your kids to do their chores. They're so pervasive, they literally affect every type of human gathering that we have, whether it's just in pairs or in groups. So have you ever been in a situation where you blurted something out in a meeting only to realize later that you totally said the wrong thing or it landed the wrong way with the people in the room? Or maybe the opposite is true, where you have left the meeting without saying something and regretted it because you didn't ask a question or you didn't volunteer some information. So when you're talking to someone or in a meeting and it isn't going well, do you take responsibility for getting that meeting or conversation back on track? Or do you feel like that responsibility lays with someone else? These are things we're going to talk about today. So last time we talked about reading the room and how our assumptions can cause us to show up in those situations in specific ways. Today, we're going to take it a step further and talk about how those assumptions influence how we engage or don't with the people that are around us. So a few questions we're going to try to answer. What happens when we're in these situations? I'll share a few examples from my own life, which is full of assumptive interactions. How do these assumptions interfere with what we decide to do next? And then how do we overcome them so that we can engage more productively with the people around us? So I'm going to give you an example of a leader that I coached one-on-one for a few years. And her team was a group of individuals prone to sort of sitting back, listening, waiting, and not really taking any responsibility for the success or outcome of the meeting. But then as I started to coach her team, they would often collectively complain about how the meetings weren't giving them what they needed. They weren't getting out of it what they thought they ought to be able to get out of it. And so I started asking them one by one, like, what are you doing about that? Well, I'm not doing anything. It's not my meeting. So it's not my responsibility. And I was like, I'm going to call bullshit on that. I actually think that that's not a very productive way to look at a meeting that you're sitting in, because if everyone is assumed to be responsible for the success of the meeting, then no one is really responsible for the meeting, right? We have to individually decide that we want to take more responsibility for the success of something. So this sort of not my job thinking is something that I notice pops up in a lot of meeting situations. Lots of companies that I've worked with over the years have experienced this same kind of dynamic where they simply feel like, well, it's not my meeting, so it's not my place to speak up or clarify or ask something. And yet we sit in these meetings tolerating disrespecting of our time. They don't end when they're supposed to end. Maybe they don't start when they're supposed to start. There's not a lot of clarity about what exactly are we trying to even get done in the course of this meeting. And instead, it ends up being this big exchange of information that really could have been an email. This scenario is one that really requires a lot of courage. Because if it isn't your meeting, quote unquote, if you are an attendee or a participant, it can be very uncomfortable right? To speak up, ask a question, say, hey, I just want to try to clarify what we're doing here today, especially if that kind of thing is not really part of the culture of your organization or team, whatever the context is. It can require a lot of courage. But most importantly, it requires some acceptance of responsibility that any meeting you're sitting in, you own part of the responsibility for the success of that meeting, even if it just comes through asking some key questions that help get things moving in the right direction and get people back on track. So, another example of this, in my early professional life, I shared a little bit in episode 1 about my background and some of the different professions that I've had or ways in which I've used my skills over the years. And early on, I showed up feeling like I had something to prove. I made an assumption that as the new person walking into this situation, I needed to prove that I belonged there. I needed to prove my worth and my value. And it caused me, because of my personality, my hardwired nature, it caused me to show up and do a lot of telling rather than asking or listening. And when I was listening, I was often only listening to respond. There are countless examples of meetings that I sat in thinking, well, this is the moment. This is where I prove I belong at this table and I didn't sleep my way into this organization or whatever other assumptions were being made about me at the time. But I would sit listening for my moment when I could respond and show how smart I was and how much I belonged sitting at that table. And there was another aspect to it, which was that if somebody got offended by something that I said or the way that I was interacting, I was like, well, that's your problem. I didn't take any responsibility for my end of that interaction. One of my kids, when he was probably 10 or 11, he and I got into an argument because he gave an example of this. I said something that he didn't like. He didn't like how it came out. He thought it was aggressive and he didn't like how I said it. And so he called me out on it. And my reaction was, well, that's your problem. You're the one that interpreted it that way. I didn't mean it that way. This just proves that you weren't really listening to me. And he stopped me and he said, Mom, if you stomp on my toe on accident and come back and say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for stepping on your toe, my toe still hurts. So just because you didn't mean for it to happen, it still hurts me. And I feel like the way that you chose to say that to me still hurt me. Clearly, my children are smarter than I am, because that's an incredibly key point. And a lot of my early professional life was like that. I would say things and I just would be like, well, I guess that's on you if you chose to interpret it the wrong way. Very arrogant, I know. Not how I operate now. The good news is that these one-on-one kinds of interactions, they're actually the easiest ones to step in and course correct, because it's just you and one other person. So to be able to say, listen, I want to stop and go back for a second. I'm not sure I'm totally understanding your intent, or I'm not sure I understand what you just said, or tell me more about that so I can fully understand your perspective. Asking questions that help you clarify your understanding of the other person. One-on-one, it's probably the easiest time to do that. It seems to be easier than in a group environment. It's also a little bit easier to admit when you're wrong, right? We don't like to admit that we are wrong in front of a group of people because pride and saving face and all that good stuff comes into it. But when we're one-on-one with someone else, it's a little bit easier to, eat your humble pie, accept responsibility for the interaction, and go back and again, course correct. I find that interpersonal communication seems to be the most ripe with assumptions. And I think the reason that this happens in our personal relationships, right? I think this happens partly or maybe mostly because we think we know the other person so well that we know exactly how they're going to respond, right? So we make this assumption that we can predict what their response is going to be. So when I was caregiving for my mother, this one came up over and over and over again. We'd always had a very combative and difficult relationship. her form of dementia came with quite a bit of lucidity. And so on certain days, I would be able to rumble with her and engage with her the way that we always had, those well-worn pathways of interaction throughout my whole life with her. And then on other days, she would be caught up in her dementia, which often manifested in a lot of hallucinations. She wouldn't make sense. Her brain wasn't firing on all cylinders. And suddenly I would have to totally make an adjustment because I would realize in the moment the assumptions I had about her ability to interpret my snarky comment the way that I intended it would happen, and it wasn't happening. And then suddenly it just felt cruel because I would realize she wasn't operating at 100%. All of caregiving was rife with these kinds of assumptions and examples. So another quick example would be that I have a very different outlook on life than my mother had. And so I assumed that getting an early diagnosis, having information, learning as much as we possibly could about what was going on would be everyone's goal. Because who wouldn't want to understand what exactly lays ahead? What can we do about it? What sorts of things could we put in place that might help slow the progress or help us manage things or plan for them a little bit better? And I made the assumption that my mother would have that same outlook because we were alike in many ways. That assumption was completely wrong. And her inability to accept at any stage the diagnosis and what was happening to her made it so that we just talked past each other all the time. And it was because those well-worn pathways existed. We both thought we knew very well what the other person was likely to say or think or feel, and we just plowed ahead accordingly. I am currently in a sticky situation with co-parenting. My wife and I have a blended family of 3 kids, and our co-parents for one of those kids very much always and often assumes the worst about us, assumes the worst about our intentions, about what we must be doing, what we must be saying to the child in question. And they have zero interest in listening to understand what we're saying. They only listen to be able to attack and defend their position. And they don't really have any interest in really understanding even what is actually happening or hearing our perspective on it. Another example of an interpersonal relationship where we've got this long track record over years where we assume that we already know how the other party is going to respond or how they're going to react to a piece of information. So I think these can be the toughest situations to overcome because these well-worn pathways of communication are really hard to break out of. If you think about a country road that's deeply rutted, right? A dirt road, there's deep ruts in it, there's water collecting in those ruts, it's muddy, and you're looking at this road thinking, how the hell am I going to navigate my way down this road? If you're just going along, minding your own business and not really paying attention, you're going to get stuck in those ruts every single time. It requires a lot of intentional effort to steer your vehicle outside of those ruts, to make a new pathway, to make sure that you don't just get stuck in that mud. And our relationships, our interpersonal relationships and the communication pathways that we follow are just like that rutted road. If we want to do something that's different, if we want to get a result that's different, we need to be able to do something different. Otherwise, we're just going to keep butting our heads up against the wall. So these kinds of relationships seem to me to be the most challenging ones to overcome those assumptions and choose a different way to communicate. So bottom line, what can we do about all of this stuff? I think that one of the most important things is ahead of time, ahead of these interactions, or even maybe in the moment, pausing and reminding yourself, do a little bit of self-talk. I think when we go into any situation where we're assuming the worst about what's going to happen, it's like what Henry Ford said. You either think you can or you think you can't, but either way, you're right. right? So if we go into an interaction assuming it's going to go really poorly, we probably are going to inadvertently do some things that contribute to that result being the outcome. But if we go in thinking positively, we assume positive intent, we assume the best is going to happen instead of assuming the worst is going to happen, that mindset will also help us navigate the conversation in a way that very well may produce a different outcome. Something else that is important to improving these human interactions, whether it's one-on-one or in a group setting, is to set really clear intentions and get agreement to those intentions. So in a meeting, for example, you could say, I'm not sure I'm totally clear about the direction we're trying to go in. Is it okay if I ask a few questions about that to try to make sure I understand so that I can engage productively and effectively in this meeting? If you're with one other person, setting the intention of, I'm really hopeful by the end of this conversation, we can make a decision about this, or we can have a better understanding between us about that. So setting clear intentions and then getting agreement that that's, in fact, a good direction to go in with the other person. Always, my advice is going to be to ask more questions. And in a future episode, we're actually going to talk about what that might look like in more specificity. And just really paying attention. Pay attention to what the other person is saying. Pay attention to their body language. Pay attention to the things that they're not saying so that you can stay really in tune in the moment in that interaction, because that opens up all kinds of doorways for you to find little ways that might improve the outcome. Ask for what you need in the moment. If you're not getting something out of the interaction, if you're feeling uncomfortable, feeling disrespected, feeling mad about something that the other person is saying, it's okay to stop the conversation and say, you know what, I need a second. I'm really hurt by the way that you just said that to me, and I want to go back. I might need a minute if that's how you meant it, but if you didn't, let's clarify that before we just kind of plow ahead. I don't think we do that often or enough. I don't think we ask for what we need in the moment. And it's really because we assume that either the other person should already know, or we assume that it's not allowed. It's not okay to ask for what we need. I'm here to push back against that. Ask for what you need. Last but not least, reflection is always a great starting point for us to think about these different interactions. Reflect on that meeting you were just in that you walked out of totally pissed off and just furious about how things went or how they didn't go or the lack of clarity or whatever it was. Sit down and really pick apart. What is it that didn't work about that? What did I not like about it? What pissed me off about it? And then when you really get behind the why of why things didn't work the way that you'd hoped or wanted them to, then you can start to think about, okay, well then what could I do next time? And you can start to make a game plan of the next meeting, I'm going to be proactive and make sure that I ask up front what we're trying to do or how much time we have. I'm going to be more courageous about saying, hey, we're about 5 minutes before when we said this meeting was going to end. Should we schedule another time to meet? Can we wrap things up? Can we review who's going to do what by when so that we all have our marching orders? All kinds of things you can do to be proactive, but you won't know what to identify as part of your strategy for being proactive if you don't stop and reflect on what's happened. So that's always a good way to proceed. Okay. Thank you for joining me today. I want you to come back next week. We're going to talk about how assumptions affect how or if we ask questions. Like I said before, since this is a staple piece of advice that I keep sharing about ways to overcome or reduce assumptions, I thought it might be good to dedicate an episode to looking at how some of our assumptions can even affect the kinds of questions we ask or don't ask. So until then, connect with me on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn at Ellen Patnode, Facebook and Instagram at Patnode Coaching. And remember what the late, great Albert Einstein said, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. We've got to do different to get different. Have a great week.